So when we as historians and students would have realized is when we look back at this kind of art and the type of terminologies and the coming of new regionalized ideas, no, not regionalized, I want to say new world, but that would bring on a new kind of study which I shouldn't be saying in my conclusion. The new world that about Mexico and so on, but what this lecture would have shown to students is that the kind of studies surrounding Spain are not so simple as they may seem. We sometimes think we know when we mention Islamic art, or we think we know when we speak about European art, but the terminologies are interestingly not so arbitrary to the political events that were taking place at the time. Muslims existed in Spain for 800 years. They were part and parcel of the evolutionary culture which existed in Spain. And it was not part of an Islamic caliphate because it broke away from the Umayyads as early as they could. And Spain reached a period of great achievements. But after the Muslims and the expulsion of Muslims, or near to the expulsion of Muslims, this term mudehar, art and architecture, creeps in. It homogenizes the arts from the minarets to the synagogues to the churches, all under one kind of banner. It creates a distance between us and them. It's very difficult to look past this kind of terminology and see Islamic art or the real Spain as being inherently, oh my God. It makes it very difficult to look at Spain with an objective view and understand what really Islam did influence in Spain. It also plays on the idea of a superior new European thought, the idea that European art and European history evolved from something which was completely separate from the East. It doesn't acknowledge the interchanges and the kind of culture which the Muslims brought to Spain, and they didn't bring it to Spain. It doesn't realize the kind of culture which grew in Spain from the influence of the Muslims. I hope this lecture for students will give them the chance to understand themselves as part of a European continuum, as part and parcel of the history that led to its formation. The new ideas of Europe, the Renaissance, the great ideals that we all live in, these were not separate from the history that we see of Islam and the history of the Muslims that lived in the regions. Islam has lived not just in Spain, but in Sicily, in other parts of Europe, in the Balkans and so forth, but it's very easy. Oh my God. Sorry. It's the last few sentences. I'm just finding it very difficult to get out. I don't know where to start from. Muslims have existed in Europe for a very long time. And historically, when we begin to scratch beneath the surface in centers like Spain or Italy or the Balkans, we begin to see that the past was not so diametrically opposed to the East as we...
Sorry, if you just want to start that sentence again.
Sorry, just one second. So when we look at the history of Islam in Europe, when we look at the history of Islam in centers like Spain, Italy, the Balkans and so forth, we realize that Islam was part of the historic formation. when we scratch beneath the surfaces of the formation of church architecture, Romanesque values to Renaissance, we find that it was not so polarized as it may seem. A lot of attention has been given to Islamic Spain. It has glorified the past, there's been romantic ideals, there's been a lot of attention of what the Muslims did and what they were. But this kind of attitude has led to this idea of a cultural survival. It's this idea that we were there, but then we are not there. What really we need to look at, as I mentioned in one of my earlier lectures, is the idea of cultural choice. We have to understand that historically there were choices made in the artistic sense that were not part of cultural survival, but these were actual choices made by the religious establishments and the social but these were choices made by the religious establishments and in the social realm too. And because of this, we have seen that the art and heritage of Spain, it has included the elements from the Muslim world. Thank you very much.
Very good. Anything else to add? We don't need to, but if there's anything you feel that you're
No.
missing.
Hold it there.
Mike.
Huh? Oh,
Mike.
has this happened before? Someone walked on.
Just leave it there. If you can't think of anything, then that's
I want to send a picture to my brother. Can you take a picture, please?
oh bless.
You've met my brother, right?
I think I have once actually.
No, from the chair.
From my
Yes,
point of view.
from your view. Got it? Just one is fine.
Let's do another one from this side. You can see two cameras on you.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
No problem.
Have you met my brother?
I think I did once. You brought him to Hijaz once.
Yeah.
Meeting though.
Okay, that's done. I
Yeah,
must have left out.
That's a
Sorry.
wrap, as they say. Can't even see.
This one is this one. Cameras on. Cameras on.
Thank you.
अब जरा थोड़ा कुछ बोलेंगे वो माइक टेस्ट.
Yeah, speak to Mike, please.
Hello?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Is the volume okay for the mic? You know, last time I was talking quite loud. If I talk at this
This level's fine. We can adjust the volume afterwards. It's just making sure that the mic picks it up.
you know, I think I was talking too loud, and that means.
No, it's not.
So if I talk as though I'm talking like this.
That's fine.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So I'll begin. Assalamu alaikum. The lecture we will have now will be based on Islamic Art from Spain. This lecture is actually, I changed it, Islamic Art from Spain. I kept the right title, sorry. Yeah? Assalamu alaikum. The lecture we will have now will be titled Islamic Art from Spain. The idea of this lecture series is to pick up on some of the ideas we discussed in the last lecture as to the formation of art in Europe, the ideas of identity, style, and of course the influences or ideas that were coming from the East, or notably the Muslims. So when we look at the general wealth of study coming from the field of Islamic Spain, it tends to be focused on what you can classify as a kind of romantic lure, meaning this kind of exotic East, even from Muslim publications, this kind of a haven for a lot of creativity and a beautiful era of life where there were Jews and Christians and Muslims who lived together. And in so far we can say it is true. But the issue which I want to really talk about in this lecture with you is how we can understand some of these concepts into the later formation years, which tend to be left out a lot. A lot of the material focuses on the early conquest of the Muslims from the 8th century all the way till the 15th century when the Muslims departed from Spain. Instead, what this lecture will look at will be focused on the actual formation towards the end of the period of the Muslims. So when we look at Islamic art or architecture from Spain, as you see in the first image, it's a building from Seville. It's a very contemporary building. I believe it's It's a very contemporary building, only built in the 1914. It's a museum of art in Seville, and if you look at the style, you'll see that it's notably Eastern. The kind of archway windows, the kind of brickwork used, the kind of roof tiles. It's mimicking a kind of presence which actually should have left Spain many centuries before. So the real question that I want to get at today is what was the lasting impact of Muslims in Spain, and how did much of the influence survive through other names? It wasn't given the name of Islamic art, but it was given other names. And it will really be helpful for students to go through the early glossary and see some of the terms that we're going to be tackling today. It will really help with understanding the kind of issues, because post-reconquest of Spain, well, reconquest I mean when, again, it's a political term which we have to use because this is what history is using. And so it is very difficult, but we will try and keep on par with this. Reconquest means the reconquest of the Christians from taking the land back from the Muslims. It was an idea that was brought about called the Reconquesta, and it stayed through in the history books, and we will have to just do as much as we can and see where we can open the course for debate. So just to begin the lecture, what I will do is I will begin on just a brief introduction, just summing up the kind of events that happened during the Muslim period of Spain, which lasted around 800 years, from 711, when Tariq bin Ziyad landed on the rocks at Gibraltar, which funnily enough takes its name from Jabal Tariq, meaning the rock of Tariq. And it's interesting how these names have survived over time. And so we will pick up from there, and then we will go through with the list of events. And you'll see in your handouts there are two timelines. One is given for a list of Muslim events and the progression of the Muslim political impact. So you have the Emirate of Cordoba, the Caliphate of Cordoba, you have the various Taifa states were smaller states broken away from the main from the main artery of Muslim stronghold, if you like, and became almost independent rules. So on one side, I've given you the list of the Muslim timeline, and on the other side, you have general political events taking place. For example, towards the end, you will see the unity of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, which led to the oust of Muslims from Spain. Do you pronounce oust? Oust. It's oust, isn't it? I was in France the weekend. I was speaking French, that's why. Okay, I'll say that again now. So where would I begin that? The events timeline, wasn't I? Yeah. So this timeline, you'll see two timelines. One is the Muslim timeline with events and political dominions that took place within the Muslim Caliphate. The split into, I'm going too far back. Where should I pick up from? Isabella, Ferdinand and Isabella, yeah? So, in the second timeline, this is general events which happen around the same time, but not to do directly with the Muslims. For example, towards the end, you have the unity of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, which ousted the Muslims from Spain. You also have the banning of Arabic, which happened a few years prior to that. There are certain events, so I've split this into two separate timelines because it's important to understand what is happening from within the Muslim stronghold and what is happening around at that time in the territory. And it's also quite important or quite good to know the history of what was also happening in France and Europe and the formation of at that time which came to be called the new ideals which would unite Europe together. And again, it created the other and the we, which we already spoke about a little bit in the last lecture. Spain. So between this period of 711 and 1492, it would be wrong to say it's a continuous struggle, but we can say that when we look at it towards the end, it was a break away from the central stronghold of the Umayyads, if you like, and the Muslims were pushing and towing on land and who could capture and regain which city and which areas. We do know, of course, that the Muslims in Spain, they were a branch from the Umayyad dynasty, which held its stronghold in Damascus. But the problem was that with the center in Damascus, authority could not be controlled in one region. So eventually the Muslims in Spain split and, of course, became the Caliphate of Cordoba, which Cordoba, we will come on to a little bit later, was renowned for its glories and heyday. And you'll find many books talking about Cordoba being a great center for learning, a great seat of knowledge, and interestingly enough, it's also given the privilege of being one of the first universities to have influenced the establishment of Oxford University in the UK. So Cordoba was not only just interesting as a seat of learning, but also as a seat of inspiration that drew from the Muslim world and brought many new things into Europe. For example, one of the famous technological innovations was the reuse of aqueducts. Muslims had learned from the existing culture, the Roman aqueduct culture, and they incorporated this into their cities. And one particular method they used was the system of qanats. And this is an old tradition which we can go back into Muslim land. Some say it came from Persia and others say it came from elsewhere. Well, this was a way of drawing water from the hillside into the city. It was a way of, you dig holes one by one, you tap into the water table along a line leading from the hilltop to the city. And with these zones, you're rising the water table at each level. By digging into the water table, which is generally, you could say, horizontal, you're raising it enough so it flows in a channel underground to the settlement area, which is a very unique innovation at the time. It allowed a lot of crop harvesting. It allowed there to be a lot of progression in a society that relies a lot on its own growth and on growth and production, you can say. Okay. Rather than dwelling too much on this idea of what the Muslims brought to Spain and how the convivencia was, which was the mutual agreement between the Jews and the Christians and Muslims, which is always glorified, and it is a very beautiful part of history to read about. And I will leave that for the students to go away and read up and have a prior knowledge, because it's very difficult to develop this kind of further understanding, which I want to get to if I'm having time to explain these early concepts. So it is important to understand these initial ideas and to get a background study on Islamic Spain. I would really recommend the documentary by the BBC, When the Moors Ruled Europe. It will be a really good way, again, of getting the background study, which will lead into some of the ideas that we will be discussing now. Now, one of the important points which I want to raise in now, that this idea of terminology, post-Reconquest and especially post-Enlightenment, when we talked about the idea of the other and the idea of the we, there came a new kind of vocabulary into Spain. Many people do say that this was around even at the time, but it is definitely aided to a kind of academic inquiry. For example, the word Mozarab, or the word Mudechar, or the word Muresco. These were terms given to different groups of people. So, if you were a Jew or a Christian who was speaking Arabic or under an Arab dominion, the word was given as a Mozarab or Muresco. For a Muslim who was, or even it became interesting enough, a non-Muslim could even be called a Mudehar. This was somebody who was, hold on to that. I think Muslims are the patron of a non-Muslim. A Muslim in the case where a Christian. Okay. Or this other term, Mudehar, could be a Muslim who was working under the patron of a non-Muslim. But the issue with these terms, and particularly with this term Mudehar, is it is led to a kind of one-sided understanding of the arts of Spain, because what happened was, after even the post-Reconquest, a lot of the art which became mildly referenced as being Eastern or Muslim became understood as being Mudehar. It may not have been a Muslim artist, and it may well have been a Christian artist, but it was called Mudehar. Even the term Mudehar is actually a very political statement, because the word dehar itself means to leave in Spanish. So those who left, it's bringing along ideas of Muslims having to leave Spain and those who stayed behind to work under the Christians. But then there's another side of the equation, there's another side of the argument, which is saying that Mudehar also means to domesticate. So the idea of Mudehar may have construed to mean to domesticate, the domesticated Arab or the domesticated Muslim. So it brings upon a very derogatory term. It's almost like having a domesticated pet. A pet, somebody who's inferior, but he's able to live amongst you. So this idea of Mudehar, it's interesting where it came from, and it's a lot of debate around it, but the point to mention at this time is its misconstrued a lot of understandings, and it's made it very difficult for us to break into what really happened in this time, and especially after the Muslims had to leave. It's allowed us not to understand the art of Muslim Spain as part of the social formation. What it's done again is it's polarized the art. It's made the art seem like it was not really part of the Spanish Peninsula. It was not really part of the inherent culture there. It was something which was foreign, and the term mudehar makes sure that it was not part of Christendom or Europe. This is one of the another problems we have with Islamic Spain, is that how do we approach to study the art? And it kind of spells back to the early questions we had in the lecture on Islamic art in Europe. How do we approach Islamic art? Is it an art produced by a Muslim in Muslim lands? Or are we attributing our own values of what we understand today on Islamic art to a point in the past? So when we look at Islamic Spain, again, should we understand this art as part of a Spanish culture that happened to be Muslim? Or was it a Muslim culture that was based in Spain? These are the kind of issues that historians face, and no matter what kind of study it is, it always has this kind of background bias. And it's very difficult to find a study of this kind of history which can really do justice to the heritage and art of this region. Which is why I don't want to spend so much time looking at the places of Cordoba, the cities of Seville, the cities of light, There is so much one could talk about, but it doesn't do justice to the formation of art, which again I want to talk about. I want to talk about Europe, the formation from Spain, the effects it had, and why it had some of these effects. So this term mudehar, or the art of the Muslims, which was the term given after the expulsion of the Muslims, we can say the high point in the mudehar period of art was, you can say, 13th, 14th century onwards. It's a complex kind of understanding. Social choice. It's a complex kind of understanding, but generally there are certain stylistic categories that historians have given to this kind of art. For example, it's the use of brick, the use of clay brick, the kind of brickwork, interlaced brickwork. And we see this in many kind of buildings, and especially the building which we saw at the start of the lecture in Seville, which was only 150 years old, but it still has very strong influences borrowed from the Muslim past. So the issue is, actually, we need to understand the formation of art in Spain as part of a cultural choice rather than a cultural survival. And this is very important, because if we are understanding art as part of a cultural survival, something survived in Spain, it doesn't make it part of the inherent construction of that place. Whereas if we look at Mudehar and a lot of these buildings, and including the one I showed at the start, and some of the churches we will come on to look at as part of a cultural choice, the fact that the Christians or even Jews in their synagogues, which we will see, chose to build their buildings in this style, it means that the Spanish identity was tied to the Muslim past, and we can't disassociate one from the other. And it does away again with these polarized understandings of history and again, arts from the Muslim world, which have been very problematic for historians, as I mentioned before. And we will see a bit more when we come on to the cathedrals, because the images are quite striking, and it's quite obvious that these choices that were made by the patrons or even the religious authorities but with the kind of churches we will see and the kind of synagogues, they were cultural choices. They were choices that were made by using Muslim art. Either they were Muslim artisans, Muslim craftsmen, or they were Christians who worked in the Muslim style. To make a comparison of the kind of zone that Spain was, it's classified as a kind of frontier zone. Frontier zone is many similarities we can see in Central Asia up until the 16th century. 13th century Anatolia and 12th century Sicily, parts of which you've already discussed already. These zones were ideas of what we call transculturalism, meaning where ideas flowed in different directions and both on the externality and within the culture. So this hybrid idea of transculturalism we see spread throughout the Al-Andalus region. Al-Andalus region, we could say the majority of Spain, from the 10th century through to, let's say, the 12th to 13th century. There were many buildings with such kind of references. If we look at the Bab al-Mardan building in Toledo, it was initially built on the remains of an old Visigothic church, which again brings out the idea about the Muslims reusing the history and making their mosques or making their construction as part of the inherent culture or the inherent building that were there at the time. This building, later in 1190, was recaptured by the Christians and it was converted into a church. But what's striking and quite interesting is that the Christians, after recapturing this region and converting it to a church, they continued the same tradition which they'd seen from the Muslims. So it was not a case of defacing the interior and so forth. It was a case of continuing the exact same style. So they continued the kind of brickwork, the kind of calligraphy inside the building. So we see this visual continuity. It's very similar actually to the mosque in Cordoba, where you see inscriptions above the arches. No, I would take that bit out. Yeah?
Why?
Because I think that's going to send off the wrong kind of... I don't want to mention Moscow, Cordoba right now.
Okay.
because I'm thinking if I go to Cordoba, it's a whole topic. If I mention it, maybe it's going to throw students off, you know.
It's such a well-known architecture, and then we could just get like a picture of it in the background.
Yeah.
So that
Okay.
they could make that
Let's.
association.
Okay. Let's do it this way, yeah. So if we look at the visual continuity of this building, we see interesting Arabic inscriptions above the frame archways, much like the 10th century mosque in Cordoba. And again, the mosque in Cordoba was a major influential point for many other buildings, including minarets which were constructed after it. The inscriptions above the archways says Al-Iqbal, prosperity, and Al-Yum, good fortune. I think that's what it means. And good fortune, eh? And Al-Yum, good fortune, placed in a jumble of letters, some legible, some illegible, above the doorways. But again, this idea of pseudo-Kufic or pseudo-calligraphy is something which is again coming to light. Many people may argue that they didn't know what they were writing. Some people would say that they knew exactly what it meant, but because it was the idea that all the faiths they did not contradict. So the idea of good fortune or good prosperity could be seen in either way, East and West, Islam. We see more a kind of organization of art forms. I can borrow tradition as long as it's tradition. And of course, having any icon, it made it much easier to be restored or in the same style. In a shared language, Santa Maria Blanca. Yes, it's a synagogue. Yeah. Do it again. Huh? We're going to look at both will be very, will cast some light on what we've already seen in the plea with the church and the vision. The first, Maria Blanca Synagogue, Lafia, Samuel Lafia. And the second is the Abu Lafia Synagogue. Yep. In the Santa Maria Blanca Synagogue, we see kind of deco. We see capitals with, it's very similar to mosque architecture. The model very visible. Design was laid out as a mosque, but it into a synagogue, so it also remained the same. Rafia Synagogue, with the king, you'll see a style and the ornament, very abstract geometry, the archways, the column, mimicking a style which not say that it's from the Muslim. It's also inscriptions in Hebrew. The Hebrew inscriptions are actually like poems. Now there's a tradition of poems entering into the religion. This actually which is in Granada. It's the idea of touching. We've gone from art to cultural borrowings. Poetry, which ran very culture there in Spain, also its way into synagogues too. Essentially, what we can these examples from is that secularization, not just in the religious, and in fact, it's very hard. The religious and the traditional easily argue that, would easily argue that was part of the fact of Spain. How long have I had so far?
Is that halfway through? Or
The way through, huh? Yeah, but I can long out this. Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a printout of the pictures? It's okay, if you don't have, it's okay.
or underneath the notes, the blur might still be.
Because that way I know what... Thank you, sis. Thank you. Polyart. Yes. No. Cannot. Okay. Ah, I still have this one out, you know, don't worry. Oof. Around the 12th century, of what we call architecture from the north, actually a way of uniting, and it was coming and in Al-Andalus territories. It's interesting now, if you like, the battle of this old inherent style is still being held on by these territories, and then this Romanesque style comes, one is being of new buildings being coming, formation of. So with the political alliances, battleground now taking place, like with the from the Cluniac churches of, and you have of course the Spanish of Spain, Al-Andalus. By now splitting at the Emirate of Al-Mohad. So what was I saying? 12th Romanesque. Okay. Century, we have this style from the Cluniac north, as in the front, which was percolating the Muslim Andalus, which by now dominion. Now Moravids, one of the two final in Spain, we could say, the tribes from North Africa. They were, if you like, the last that we have in Muslim. What is interesting in terms of architecture, now we're beginning to part of two. They have this kind of Roman Renaissance proportion, combined with a very Islamic style of decor in the facade of the 16th century facade. It has variations with kind of modern Arabic ornamentation. So it's a blend compromise that's being made, because it kind of shows and the coming of new, the kind of tradition for the Spanish in general, actually. This finally became to be known as a plateau. And what what happened was, with the Europeans into the Spanish and so forth, they transported, rebuilt into neo-mudéjar. But notice the term, the idea of a mudéjar, Muslim working under non-Muslim. It doesn't make sense because there are no Muslims there, but yet of terminologies yet problematic for us to understand. So what was happening is saying this spanning to hold on to 8 of Islamic influence, versus yoke of determinism, which was coming via France. Sorry. So, traditional version, okay. This Spanish has gained so much from Islamic influence, yokes of European identity in the form of churches and which were coming in and trying. But the problem, art historian of, again, and what was non-classical became known as, we guessed from the previous lecture, styles which are in with the new ideals of styles, which were not part of Europe. The status of modern, the artisans, into the 15th century. Again. So survived and stayed craftsmen from the 60s was when it really diminished. Across Europe, actually, particular styles were being abandoned of international, and as I've already national style, with the new movements of and Renaissance. It's interesting at the Modernas and how it wasn't until when was it, 17? Yeah. Until 1612 with the fire that it almost completed. This is as Moderna academic term that's used in Moderna was finished, and it was a kind of Inquisition and the meaning of its past on the narratives of many centuries, even after the expulsion of Muslims from Spain. It did play trying to get rid of this. Ironically, to rid it was part. We will say that the final now. These are even Christian, maybe or someone, anybody suspected of foreign was expelled. It continued in kind of terms. Now with their heart or continued in a different light. Continued under the guise, you could say, that Europe gave it. That the Rome, which came from France, heavily influenced by, and we.
Not being in the table after changes and it.
Okay.
All of that. Sorry to interrupt.
Should I do?
You can carry on from now, but it's in. That's better.
How long?
20 till we've done an hour. Wrap up the whole lecture by you.
Yes, I can. Maybe another 15. Stretch it, yeah?
Let's see. 20 minutes is fine.
Many speak about the critique, the understand Spain. As I may have already introduced, the kind of narrative when we deal with Islamic, away from the kind of fantasized idea that's to hearing about Spain. But in reality, when we start to explain what is Muslim, what is Jew, especially, we're actually angle a high difficult for us, religious.
Sorry, we have to start.
It's fine.
We can't let the noise. I'm just going to do this and get it to start. It's going so well. Okay, let's disruption.
Did I finish that last sentence? Do it again, yeah?
Sorry. No idea. Quite this building work going on, isn't there? know the guy that's the building work? They're making tired him, and it's not weird. In the middle of filming, you know, in the background suddenly, we need to stop that. Or you might have it down. Okay. They do building work.
After 15 minutes.
15. Oh, okay, that's fine. Break.
मेरा मेकअप नहीं हुआ.
We're buying some, don't worry. Next time you come, we have a full makeup.
It's on.
Thank you.
Oh. We come to understand our art and architecture from Spain in particular, so as to understand more about Islamic art, and its connect way of thinking. And this is true to that Mudeha art. But before we understand this, I will just give beautiful example and prominent examples today in the region of Spain. Seville, tower or minaret is still actually, it was part of the great, which was an issue. Christian, they kept the tower because it was and they felt they could get a new cathedral. Tower was an estate, and it was something which was a city, and this word is key here, because when the Muslims had constructed by the Almohad century, I need to check the date, 11, I think it is 12.
Okay. When it's 12th century, and then confirm we use that one, yeah? And then we'll choose afterwards. No chance of 13th century.
Definitely not.
So yes, I need to call you and ask you to come.
Okay. So was Almohads in the century. The architect, it was a part of a triad, being in Kutukesh, the other one being in North. Now, what's interesting, climatized is so important. The Muslims didn't Andalus or Seville and copy and paste, they were already familiar with Seville. They actually, local tradition and culture they built, and they were already, they actually built it on ashlars. Today, and you go to the bay, you will really see, or placed at the bay. Again, continuing past. It was a culture. It was not to destroy a political hegemony, but it was part of the style. See style in poetry, Andalusi music, as being a very music coming from Al-Andalus, not North Africa. It was not this European France or someone, but Andalusian music. So this idea of a key to understand. So what do we kind of architecture, Muslim expulsion here from the, which I haven't spoken. Again, it has a very literature, and I will go away and read up on those of Tower of in Seville, which the one which was an mosque, and of course synagogues, which we studied earlier. These buildings have in common, understand them all to be. We learn from this. A key to understanding these a moment ago in the La Giralda, as it's called, the idea of the assimilation that is part of their artistic, the idea that they learned from and they transformed it. They took the indigenous and they made it vernacular, meaning they learned from the past, reappropriated it. Or art, a famous art, it was giving into old forms. As Oleg Grabar has said, it was to old forms. And if we think of Islam, this is exactly, it's coming down to realigning something, to stampede over realignment to that is there, but Islam just the towards a goal, and it's the heritage. So if we try to disintegrate Spain and we try to give it words, periods, actually it makes it, because essentially we're a very hybrid world. It's not easy to make Spain with the different political events, and we can say is that, or what we would make influence, or what we could say of Islamic legacy, all the way through to 18 and 9. We have the arrival of a Gothic. The Gothic came with trying to relate back to understand man's, and again, it borrowed Islamic, and we see the form of the great mosque archways in Madrid, in the archways in the style. If come a little bit more 19th century, a little bit, it was only until the night that the religious seemed to give way and were able to really explore. It was at this stage, the romantic movement and industrial revolution. We have the art in Europe, and interestingly, at this stage, the works of the modern Greek and so on, so and so forth, coming forward with these more contemporary. Oh my God, did I just say? No, that's century. Okay, okay. If we come a bit more forward, we begin to see the yokes of its religious begins to become free with its art tradition and history, to see romantic industrial age, and it's in what kind of precedence. And this is we also see the UK, where we see a Morris trying to world, and strangely art they chose to was that of the Alhambra or the Arabesque Indian style. We know, of course, famous architect's history, his early works by in his work, the kind of geometry that he chooses. And we see this, the kind of rise of our freedom to explore its history now is this neo-Mudehar or Mudehar. But had it been a more closer past, five?
Next 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, for my conclusion. So what I have read in the handouts for the so for the handouts, God. So what I've done, the handouts, just sits with this idea, Mudehar. Mudehar art was an art that was Dalmatian and assimilation, were indigenous to Spain. I'm not going to say it was an Islam, because in the kind of art that was acclimatized was, in fact, yes, it should be careful about giving references which may or may not be influenced or as part of a idea. The Mudehar that grew from the indigenous to the region. It is of Christians, the coming of Christians.